Welcome to the worst nightmare of all. Reality.
Number 1.
4 years ago, I was finally able to move to a big city, one I had wanted to live in all my life. I had just turned 23, had a well-paying job, and many of my friends already lived there. I rented out a shabby studio apartment and got myself a cat. I was absolutely in love with the city. For a while. It all started at a punk show in an unkept dive bar. Penis doodles on the walls, sticker toilets, my natural habitat. I had been drinking heavily and got very sociable, made the rounds to greet my group of friends, got free birthday beers, and had a great time. I stood right at the stage for most of the show because the band was genuinely amazing. It took me a while to notice the tall skinhead guy standing about 5 feet from me. He was very tall, not fat or skinny. Maybe broad is the right word. He had a shaven head, boots and braces and all that. I didn't pay much attention to him as I was focused on the band. During my cigarette breaks and while watching the band, I noticed he was always sort of nearby, but I assumed he must be socializing with common friends. At one point I was standing in front of the stage, and a mosh pit had formed behind me. He was in it, and whenever he circled back around me, he would sort of shove me, attempting to get me in the pit, but I didn't join because I was wasted and knew I would get hurt if I did. The show ended and everyone was saying their goodbyes when I realized I lost my bus pass. It was too far to walk home, and none of my friends would let me crash at their place. I was in the middle of begging my friends for a ride or bus money when the skinhead guy approached me saying that he could drive me home. He was clearly intoxicated, and I knew I shouldn't ride with a drunk driver, but so was I, and it was raining, and I never made the best decisions. While in the car, I got my first good look at his face. He wasn't ugly, but it looked like he could pass for 35 or 40. He drove surprisingly well and got me home safe. At the apartments, he asked if he could hang out inside. I told him no, that my cat doesn't like strangers. He seemed fine with it and told me goodnight and left. Exactly 1 week later, I discovered flowers at my front door. There was no indication of who had sent them, but I hate flowers, so I threw them away. A few weeks later, he called me. Apparently, he got my number from a friend. He asked me if I wanted to go to dinner that weekend. I was really creeped out by this. I wasn't used to men hitting on me or being so direct. I declined, saying that I had to work that weekend, which wasn't true. That weekend, I went to a house show. There were no other skinheads attending this show, so I thought he wouldn't be there. But of course, he was. I avoided him for most of the night and tried having a good time. When I realized this guy had done nothing wrong to me, he had been nothing but nice and helpful. He just had a crush. So why was I being so cold to him and getting so creeped out? I decided to say hi to him and be friendly. He acted friendly back, and we shared some whiskey and chatted. At one point, he put his arm around my waist, and people teased us for looking so sappy. Around 3 a.m., the party died down, and everyone either left or passed out around the house. I was outside smoking on the front curb when he came out and bummed a smoke off me. He seemed kind of angry with me out of nowhere and started going off on me for lying about having to work that day and refusing dinner. He accused me of being a tease. His outburst was so sudden and unprovoked. He caught me off guard, as he had been so nice just a while ago. I tried telling him I took the day off, but he didn't believe me. He asked me if I liked him. At this point, I started to realize how unhinged he was. I told him I did. Now keep in mind, I was drunk, and I said this attempting to avoid a physical confrontation. This was a terrible mistake. He grabbed my arm and started towards his car, saying that if I really liked him, I would come to his car and fuck him. I tried pulling away and yelled something like, "You leave me the fuck alone." When I turned to go back inside, he grabbed the back of my hair and slammed me to the ground. My head hit the pavement really hard. I couldn't comprehend anything for a while. I remember him above me yelling, but I couldn't understand what he was saying. I only remember just lying there, not moving, or saying anything, or screaming. But apparently I had been screaming, loud enough to wake up most of the people in the house. They told me later that they ran out to see what all the commotion was about, and saw me lying in the road screaming. He was beating up on me. I have no recollection of the beating. They chased after him, but he got in his car and drove off. They took me to the hospital where I had to get 5 stitches on my head and had a broken nose. I was released 2 days later when they confirmed I didn't have a concussion. After my release, I learned more about this guy from my friends. Apparently, he had been telling people we hooked up that night he gave me a ride home, and led people to believe that we were seeing each other since then. His roommates told me that he would leave, claiming that he was hanging out at my place, and returned early the mornings after. He never did show up to my house, as far as I know, but possibly stalked the place at night. These same roommates of his assured me that they took care of him, and he jumped states before I was even released from the hospital. He hasn't tried contacting me again since. It took me months to heal physically, and I've become very paranoid and very untrusting towards nearly everyone. I lost many friends because of what happened, and a lot of people didn't believe me, except for the ones who helped me out that night, and the guy's roommates that ran him out of state. They've become very close friends with me, and helped me get through this ordeal. I don't live in the city anymore, and I really miss it sometimes, but I feel much safer in my small town.
Number 2.
When I was a kid, my dad and I moved in with my grandparents for a while. My grandparents' house was very large and in the middle of nowhere. The entire house was built out of wood and sheetrock, so the outside was this dark wooden color, and so were the areas that hadn't been covered with sheetrock as a design quirk. Everything was always creaking as the house was very old, and every single decoration that my grandparents had looked like it belonged in a museum. My room was in the basement, which in this house wasn't completely below ground, so the windows in my bedroom faced out into the wide open backyard. Like I said, this house was in the middle of nowhere, so when it got dark, it got really dark. There were trees surrounding the house on all sides, as the driveway wasn't even a straight path. It curved through the surrounding forest before meeting the main road. I was home alone frequently, as my dad worked and my grandparents liked to go out. So without even having any pets in the house, when I was left alone, I was isolated. I was probably the only person around for miles. My bedroom in the basement happened to share a wall with the laundry room, but the laundry room was only accessible if you walked out of my room, up the stairs towards the front door, turned right, went down the second set of stairs, and walked down into another basement area that wasn't connected to my section of the basement. I know, it was a pretty weird design. That section of basement had a side door that opened up into the side of an attached shed. A lot of times when my dad came home, he forgot to lock the door behind him, because it was kind of a door within a hall really, if you count the shed. Anyway, despite the laundry room being literally right there, it was still a long walk from my bedroom. Whenever people would do laundry, I would hear them climbing up the creaky steps, and slamming the door of the dryer, etc. One day I was home alone after school, and I was sitting on the couch drawing, when I heard someone knock on the front door. I peered out the window to see someone standing there. Me being 15, I thought I was old enough to be an adult. I got up and went to go answer the door. The door had large glass windows on either side of it, so I could easily see who was outside. There was a man standing there. He was a Caucasian male, had a large beard with brown messy hair. He was dressed in a flannel shirt and overalls, and literally looked like a lumberjack. Thanks to the windows, I could see him as easily as he could see me. I was going to open the door, but then he stepped up to the window so quickly that I froze. I just stood there while he waited, almost like he was expecting something. It was then I decided not to open the door. Hi, I called out hesitantly.
Hey,
He greeted me in a voice that was way too loud.
Is Mary home?
Mary was my grandmother's name, but most people who knew her well called her Mary Lou. I stared at him through the glass, not knowing what to say.
I think I got her mail by accident. Could she come to the door so I can talk to her?
They're not home, I replied stupidly. The man smiled.
And they left a pretty young thing like you home alone?
I didn't say anything for a moment and then pointed to the bench on the porch. If you want, you can leave the mail on the bench, and I'll let them know you stopped by. The man stared back at me in dismay, but finally nodded.
Okay. You have a good day.
Later I found out it was only a piece of junk mail. I told my grandparents about the man when they got home, and they told me they had no idea who it could have been. So a few weeks passed, and I had pretty much forgotten about the man. Aside from drawing, my hobby was polishing long branches that I found in the forest, and made staffs out of them. I would spend a lot of time in the woods listening to music and twirling the staffs in my hands, and teaching myself how to toss them and catch them like batons. I got pretty good at it after a while. One day I was outside doing this when that same man approached me. He had crossed our backyard and walked right up to me. I had my headphones in so I didn't hear him coming. I nearly screamed when I turned around and saw him standing beside me, practically within arm's reach. He greeted me in a voice that was way too loud again, and reminded me that he was my neighbor and he had seen me from his section of the woods and wanted to ask me about my staff. I pretty much just shut down and refused to answer any of his questions, with anything more than shrugs and grunts. What was really bothering me was that I knew there was no one within eyeshot that could have seen me that wasn't on our own property. The nearest house was several miles away. I made an excuse about having to go back inside, and I went through the shed entrance, which in hindsight was a really stupid thing to do. From back inside the house, I watched him saunter off into the woods. I didn't even feel bad for blowing him off. This guy had no business walking into our section of the woods and approaching a teenage girl. Several weeks later, I was home alone again, and I was drawing on my computer in my room, when I heard the bottom two stairs creak from the other side of the wall, where the laundry room was. I froze, wondering who it possibly could be. I hadn't heard the front door open upstairs, and it was too early for my dad to be home. Starting to panic, I left my room and hid in the storage closet under my section of stairs. I used my phone as a light and crammed myself in between two boxes. I pressed myself down as far as I could. I was horrified to hear the laundry room steps continue to creak. Even though I was in the next room over, something in my gut told me it wasn't my dad, because he wouldn't be climbing the stairs so slowly and carefully. I waited holding my breath as I could hear the ceiling above me creak. The footsteps slowed and then backtracked, as though the intruder was trying to figure out the strange layout of the house. Then I heard the stairs above me begin to creak. I panicked as I realized whoever it was had found their way into the section of basement where I was hiding. Suddenly I heard the footsteps quicken and the front door was opened and then shut. A few minutes later I heard my grandparents walk inside. The man had pretended to wait at the front door for them, and my grandparents didn't even notice that the front door was unlocked. I cautiously got out of the storage area and stood at the base of the stairs, mostly hidden behind the corner, just peeking out to see what was going on. But he saw me. He waved and grinned at me like he was my friendly uncle. I did not wave back. He was acting friendly and confident, not at all like a man who was just almost caught for breaking and entering. We moved a short while later, and thankfully my grandparents have never heard from him since.
Number 3.
I was in 5th grade when this happened. My brother is 3 years older than me, so he was in 8th grade at the time. I'm now 24 and he's 27. We lived on a dirt road in the middle of nowhere surrounded by trees, with my grandparents' house 30 feet across the yard. My dad's job used to require him to work 12-hour shifts, This incident happened when he was working from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. It was only me, my brother, and my mother at home. My grandparents were at their house across the yard as well. It was probably around 9 p.m., and we were sitting in the living room watching some TV before heading to bed. From the living room window, you can see my grandparents' house clearly, as well as the dirt road behind it, so you can see a car's headlights before you see the actual car. While watching TV, I happened to turn my head and notice headlights coming from down the road. As the car came into view, I noticed it began to slow down. I expected my fear to be alleviated when I saw the car continue to roll past the house, but it didn't. The headlights just barely managed to shine past the corner of the house, so I could tell that the car had come to a complete stop out front. I told my brother and my mother what I saw, and they came to the window to witness it themselves. My mom told us not to panic. It may just be somebody needing directions. Of course, I didn't think of this at the time, but what person drives down a dirt road, needing directions at this time of night? We all waited at the window for what seemed like the longest few minutes of my life, and my imagination was going wild with horrible scenarios that my grandparents were possibly facing. Finally, the car came into view past my grandparents' house, and within a few seconds it disappeared down the road. About a minute later, our house phone rang, and my mother picked up. It was my grandmother on the other end. She said that some truck had stopped in front of their house, and a shirtless man had knocked on their front door. My grandmother, who had answered the door, called my grandfather over to her and asked the man if they could do something for him. The man said that he needed my grandfather to give him a ride somewhere up the road. This request was extremely odd, because there was someone else sitting in the driver's seat of the truck. My grandfather declined his request because of there already being somebody with the man, and he couldn't imagine why the man needed a ride specifically from him. There was a screen door separating them from the man, and after my grandfather declined his request, he became visibly angry and started yelling while beating on the steel part of the screen door. My grandparents closed the heavier wooden door in front of the man's face and watched him from the window until he got back in the truck and left. After my mother had gotten off the phone, she called my dad and explained everything to him. Being that he works a good hour and 10 minutes away, and the fact that nobody was threatened with a weapon, he just told my mom to call the cops and have them check out the woods around the houses, just to be sure the man and his companion weren't trying to stake us out. We knew a cop that went to the same church as us. He came shortly after and brought another policeman with him. They drove both of their patrol cars up to the tree line and shined their huge spotlights into the woods. After he and the other cop had done a thorough sweep of the property, they reported that they found nothing suspicious and told us to call them if we heard anything else. After the cops left, my mom called my dad back and told him that everything seemed to be okay. However, the next morning, when my mom was taking me and my brother to school, we were driving in the opposite way which the truck had gone the night before. We hadn't even traveled a mile before we saw something strange. There was a black knit cap, along with a shirt and a pair of pants and shoes lying on the side of the road, and they looked as if they had been taken off in a hurry. By the time we came home from school, the clothing was gone. Nothing ever showed up on the news, and the cops said they hadn't seen or heard anything about it either. It's been 15 years since that happened, and to this very day, I'm still left wondering what would have happened if my grandfather had agreed to give the shirtless man a lift to God knows where.
There's always a reason to be afraid.